I want to start by telling you a little story about how I got into this topic. And it was at the height of COVID back in 2020, at the peak of Zoom teaching. I know some of you maybe still teach online. The majority of my teaching is in person now, but back then everything was on Zoom. And I decided to end one class about 20 minutes early. We were finished. There was nothing else for the students to do, and I was looking forward to a longer lunch break. And everybody left except for one student. And she said, "Do you mind if I stay in the Zoom room?" And I said, "No, but is everything okay?" And she said, "Yeah, it's fine. It's just I have a task that I really need to finish, and I work better when there's somebody else working with me. Is that okay? Can I stay?" And I said, "Yeah, of course. I have a task to do as well. So let's do that." We muted our microphones, we left our cameras on, and we worked for about 20 minutes. And I was surprised to find that I was able to finish a task that I had been putting off for weeks. And it didn't take me that long, but I've been putting it off for weeks. So we both managed to get something done. And, I patted myself on the back. I said, "Good job, teacher. You helped a student today." And then I went and I ate my lunch. But there was something that kept bugging me. I thought to myself, okay, yeah, of course I'm happy to help individual students when they ask for support, but what about those who don't ask for support? What about the rest of the class? What am I doing in my classes to help students with ADHD? So I did what I always do when I have a question like this, and I went to Google. I looked up language learning, language teaching, ADHD, and unfortunately, there were not that many resources out there. And so that's why I decided to do my PhD research on this topic, to find out more. And that's what I'm looking at now. I'm looking at specifically language testing and to see if extended time testing accommodations are actually helpful for people with ADHD. But my ultimate goal throughout all of this is to help my students and to help your students. And so I hope you keep that in mind while you listen to my presentation. So here's what I'm going to talk about today. We're going to start with a poll, which you already know from Claire's talk and Bulow's talk if you were around for that. There'll be 3 questions for you to answer. Then I'll talk a little bit about what equity means, what it means in this context. We'll talk about what ADHD is to give you a better idea if you don't already know. And then, of course, the all-important tips for supporting learners with ADHD. And you'll notice that there is a lot of overlap with the other 2 talks that you heard today. But it doesn't hurt to hear things more than once. And then hopefully at the end, we'll have some time for the Q&A. Can we get the first poll question, please? All right, so you should see it pop up on your screen. Which of the following best describes your understanding of attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, or ADHD? And as you might have noticed, for some reason, the panelists aren't able to see the answers. So my lovely assistant, Will, is going to help me.
I'm here. I'm ready to serve.
Do we have enough to give some answers yet, or are we still waiting for people to answer?
I think we're good.
All right.
So I have a strong understanding of ADHD and its impact on learning is 10%.
Mm-hmm.
I have a basic understanding of ADHD is 38%. I am somewhat familiar with ADHD, but I'd like to learn more is 38%.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not very familiar with ADHD. So it's kind of 80-20 mix. Kind of
Okay.
10, 80, 10.
Yep. Yep. It's pretty similar to the first session as well, because I wrote down the numbers for that. All right, thank you. So can we have the second question now?
I think this audience is very well trained now with these polls.
Have you received any formal training or professional development related to teaching students with ADHD?
Okay, so extensive training is staying pretty low at 1%.
What?
1%.
Wow. Okay.
Some training is 24%.
Mm-hmm.
I've done my own research is 28%.
Hmm.
Oh, I'm sorry, Vicky, none at all is 48%.
That's a couple of percent higher than the first session. Yeah.
Yeah.
No, I mean it's of course it's disappointing on the one hand, but on the other hand, it's nice to know that I'm on the right path and I'm doing something that will hopefully help people. And the
Definitely.
last question, please. How confident are you in your ability to effectively teach students with ADHD?
I feel like an assistant on a game show. Countdown or something.
We got to get you a sparkly vest.
I'll just let it simmer for a bit.
Got it. Trying to keep up with the chat, but it's impossible.
Okay, so very confident is 7%,
Hmm.
6% thereabouts. Somewhat confident, 30%. Not very confident is 48%.
Hmm.
And not at all confident is 15%.
That's weird. Last time it was 30, 48, 15, so it's almost exactly the same.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Very
Wow.
interesting.
Okay. Yeah.
All right. Thank you so much, Will.
You're welcome.
So hopefully by the end of the session, the confidence, your confidence will have gone up a little bit. And those of you who answered none at all to the training or professional development will be able to change that a little bit and say, you know what, you have had some training. All right, so let's move on. On the next slide, and if you've seen one of my talks before, you've probably seen the picture on the next slide before. I'm going to show you a photo, and I would like you to answer in the chat what you see in the photo and who it is for. Okay, here we go. In the chat, what do you see on the photo and who is it for? Pavement, yes. Earthquake damage, interesting. Pavement for disabled, bikes or wheelchairs, wheelchairs, pedestrian, pavement, low pavement for wheelchairs and bikes, a dipped curb, hey, um, a crack, pavement for wheelchairs, it's a pavement for wheelchairs, accessibility, for mums with strollers, aha, now we're getting somewhere. Adapted for prams, you can skate, ramps, lowered pavement for us all, very interesting. Wheelchairs, accessible for everybody. A lot of you were seeing the road damage. That wasn't my intention with the photo, but maybe a little bit. Adapted pavement for people with physical problems, wheelchair access, rollerblades, skaters, old people, accessible pavement. Okay, so we can see that maybe it was just a mistake. That's a very interesting comment. So we can see that this was probably initially designed this way with wheelchair users in mind. But from the wide variety of things that you have written in the chat, you can see that it's actually helpful for a large number of people. People with heavy suitcases, delivery people with trolleys, parents with prams, maybe little kids on scooters or bikes. If you've broken your leg and you're on crutches, I don't know if you are walking in high heels and you broke a heel or something. Honestly, the, the list is kind of endless. But this is something that I think has been coming up in Claire's talk and in Bulo's talk as well. This idea that if we help the most vulnerable of us, then we inevitably help everybody as well. Okay? It doesn't hurt to help the ones among us who need the most help. And so that's what I want to talk about when I talk about equity. And I have a quote for you. There's an ingrained societal suspicion that intentionally supporting one group hurts another, that equity is a zero-sum game. So a lot of people believe that if we help one group of people, that means another group is being hurt. Zero-sum game is a game where one person wins and one person loses. That is not the case with equity. Equity is not a finite resource. When we help one group, we can also help other groups. And as I said, when we help the most vulnerable, we all benefit. And during this presentation, that's what I want you to keep in mind. I'm going to give you lots of tips, and Claire and Bulo have given you lots of tips that are specifically for autistic learners and dyslexic learners and learners with ADHD. But I also want you to think about, how could these tips help all of my students, right? Later on, for example, I'm going to talk about giving deadline extensions, excuse me, as something that I think is helpful for people with ADHD who may struggle with organization. But deadline extensions, I've had students make use of deadline extensions for all sorts of things. They have a lot of stress at work because a lot of my students work. They had a death in the family. They are sick. Maybe someone they're caring for is sick. It really could be a wide variety of reasons. But by just offering a blanket deadline extension to everyone, hoping that the most vulnerable will use it and will benefit, everybody benefits. So let's talk a little bit about what ADHD is. But before we do, I'd like to remind you that there's no one unifying example of a person with ADHD. If you've met one person with ADHD, you've met one person with ADHD. Everybody's very different, okay? Everybody has different strategies, different coping strategies. Everybody deals with their diagnosis differently. Some people choose to disclose it. Some people choose not to disclose it. Some people go to therapy, take medication. Some people don't. Some people choose not to even go out and get an official diagnosis, even though they might be pretty sure that they have ADHD. And everybody has good days and bad days. There are things which might be very, very challenging for somebody one day, and the very next day they're doing that task with ease. So I want you to keep all of those things in mind. And just like Claire mentioned in her talk, this is a disorder, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, or at least the name says it's a disorder. I don't support this belief. I also support the neurodiversity perspective, and I think it's just a different way of thinking and living, and perhaps it's the society that's a little bit disordered, but that's a talk for another day. So some of you might know that there are different types of ADHD, and in the medical literature, they are called presentations, not types. There is the inattentive type, inattentive presentation. There's the hyperactive and impulsive presentation, and there's the combined presentation. Okay, so let me tell you a little bit more about those. The inattentive presentation is people who have this presentation, they might have difficulty sustaining attention in and organizing tasks and activities. So basically staying focused, paying attention can be difficult. They might not look like they're listening to you even when you're speaking to them directly. They might not follow through on instructions and schoolwork, and they might even get perhaps halfway through a task and then forget what they were doing and get distracted by something else. They might make careless mistakes in their work, not mistakes which show a lack of understanding, but mistakes that show perhaps they were working too quickly. And they might completely avoid or be reluctant to take on tasks which they know are going to take them a long time, or take on tasks which they think are going to take on a long time, but might actually be finished in 5 minutes. The next type is hyperactive or impulsive presentation. And this is what you might think of when you think of ADHD, the stereotype of the naughty schoolboy who can't sit still, leaning back in his chair in the classroom, disruptive. This is a stereotype that I hope will eventually just go away, because it can be quite harmful and it can prevent a lot of people from getting the help that they need. But it's a stereotype for a reason. So the person who has this type of ADHD might leave their seat when they're not really supposed to. And as adults, and I'll talk a little bit about adulthood ADHD in a minute, but as adults, a lot of people have sort of trained themselves to stay seated, but that energy, that hyperactivity doesn't necessarily go away. It's more in your head, and it's an inner tension or a restlessness. Your thoughts are unable to settle. Your thoughts are running, and it's very difficult to stay calm and cool. A person with this type of ADHD might talk excessively, blurt out answers before you've even finished asking the question. They might find it difficult to wait their turn when they're talking in a group, and they might interrupt others as well. But of course, I don't just want to focus on the things that people with ADHD struggle with. Let's have a look at some of the strengths that they have as well. So unfortunately, the strengths in ADHD are hugely under-researched. There really isn't that much out there yet, but it looks promising. There's been a lot of studies done in the past 2 or 3 years, and so I hope that those keep coming. But the one study that I'm quoting here, Shippers and team, they found that hyperfocus, sensitivity, and flexibility were some of the strengths that they found in groups of people with ADHD. Hyperfocus, for those of you who don't know, is a period of intense focus, and it can last a really long time. And it can be so intense that people who are in a period of hyperfocus forget to eat, forget to drink, put off going to the bathroom until the last possible minute. They are hyper-focused, as the word sounds. And perhaps one of the things that we can do as teachers is to sort of tap into that hyper-focus and find what it is that students are interested in and play to their strengths. Another thing, thing that was considered a strength for students with ADHD is sensitivity. And in this case, it's sensitivity to people's feelings and emotions. So a person with ADHD might be more aware of very subtle changes in, let's say, their speaking partner's face or demeanor, and they might more quickly pick up on, let's say, a shift in emotion, a person being in a bad mood, perhaps, than neurotypical people. And the last one that was found in the study is flexibility, and this is not physical flexibility necessarily, but sort of social flexibility, psychological flexibility, being able to change plans at the last minute, spontaneity, flexible ways of thinking, adaptation, those sorts of things. So those are the strengths. And now to give you some facts and figures before I move on to the tips. You will see lots of different numbers when it comes to how many people have ADHD, and it's difficult to pin down. The study that I'm using, which is a little over 10 years old, says that ADHD affects 5 to 7% of children, and it's highly inheritable. What does that mean? That means that 70% of the ADHD that is out there in the world can be explained by a person's parents. So that means one of their parents has it, basically. There are some other causes. I think like childhood trauma is being explored as a potential cause, but mostly it's genetic, highly inheritable. So if one person has it in a family, there's a high chance that other people have it also. And a more recent study said that that number is as high as 9.4% in the US. This doesn't necessarily mean that there are more children with ADHD in the US. I just feel like in the US, it's been destigmatized. It's become a lot more normalized, and people no longer feel ashamed speaking about it, talking to parents about it, talking to doctors about it, and getting the support for their children that they need. Boys are twice as likely to be diagnosed as girls. Again, this doesn't necessarily mean that boys have it more than girls. But if you think back to the two different presentations, and imagine you have a quiet, inattentive girl who likes to stare out the window, and a not so quiet, hyperactive boy who can be disruptive in the classroom, which student do you think is going to get the teacher's attention, and which student do you think the teacher is going to want to fix, for lack of a better word? It's probably going to be the student that is a little bit more disruptive, who will, get a note home to the parents and say, hey, I think maybe we need to talk about your son. But nobody's going to notice the girl who forgets her homework a couple of times and kind of just coasts through, basically, unfortunately, because there's this pervasive stereotype. Also, there are some groups that are typically underdiagnosed. Again, from this US study in 2021 showed that Asian, Hispanic, and Black children are less likely to be diagnosed. The study didn't necessarily say why, but again, it could be issues of stigma. Yeah, it's very difficult to say because there are high levels of stigma all around the world surrounding mental health and neurodevelopmental disorders like ADHD, like autism, dyslexia, and so on and so forth. What does it look like for adults? Yes, adults can have ADHD. There is a mistaken belief that ADHD does not persist into adulthood, but it does. The numbers here are that it affects 2.5 to 5% of adults. However, in this study, Ginsberg and his team go on to say that 80% of adults who have ADHD don't have a diagnosis. 80%. So try to keep that in mind. That might mean that they chose not to get a diagnosis or they simply do not know that they have ADHD. So when you see these low numbers, keep in mind that there's a very high number of undiagnosed adults out there. And as we already heard in the previous talk, there is a frequent co-occurrence of ADHD with a lot of other disorders. So-called pure ADHD, where a person only has ADHD, is actually very rare. That only occurs in 5% of cases. It is much more likely for a person to have one of these other disorders, so-called disorders. I hope you know every time I say disorder, I'm saying it with air quotes. So frequent co-occurrence with autism, dyslexia, dyscalculia, which has to do with counting and arithmetic, math, dyspraxia, which is a developmental coordination disorder, depression, dysthymia, which is a mood disorder, anxiety disorder, substance use disorder, bipolar disorder, and personality disorder. I'm saying this to draw your attention to the fact that the student, I mean, for going back to the previous talk, the student who you think is just lazy could actually be struggling with a lot of these things. And from what I've heard from speaking to people with ADHD, many of them feel a very deep feeling of shame because they do not want to forget deadlines. They do not want to forget to sign up for things. They don't want to forget to renew their passport and realize it the day before a flight. That is very hard for them and very shameful and embarrassing. And so they don't need our judgment. They need our support and our empathy. And I hope that that's something that I can get across to you today. Okay, so next I'm going to talk about what an inclusive classroom might look like, and I'll give you some specific tips. Maybe you can put in the chat what you believe an inclusive classroom would look like before I read you a quote from some of my favorite authors. So go ahead and put in the chat, what do you think an inclusive classroom would look like? What makes a classroom inclusive? Considering the different ways students can process information, multisensory teaching, very interesting. Activities that target different intelligences, everyone feels good, pair work, collaborative work, and now it's going too fast for me to read. Everyone can learn, cater for everyone in the group, a place where everybody's accepted and respected, engagement of all students, collaboration, work in pairs, it must be tolerant, flexible, open to changes, place where everyone belongs and feels successful, comfortable environment for everyone, differentiated teaching, where you teach neurotypical students to understand, respect, and include the other ones and cater for every need. I really like that. I think if we can build a classroom where we teach all of our students to be allies for each other and to advocate for each other so that the students who need the support don't always have to ask for it, I think that's a wonderful place. A lot of collaborative learning I'm seeing, tailoring, making sure students don't have to sit all the time but can move while learning. Yeah, that's one of my tips. Did you come to the earlier presentation? Thank you for your ideas. Keep them coming. Yes. So here's a quote from one of my favorite books, and I know people were asking for books in the last session. I don't know if you'll be able to see it with my filter. It's Teaching Languages to Students with Specific Learning Differences. This is the second edition of the book. It's by Judith Karmosh, who's my PhD supervisor, and Anne Margaret Smith. It's a really great resource. It's made for teachers, but it's research backed, which I think makes it really powerful and talks about all aspects of teaching languages. And here's what they say about the inclusive classroom. In its purest form, inclusion calls for a radical restructuring of the education system so that it will be equipped to accommodate all learners. And as such, it looks beyond the integration of disabled learners in the mainstream to a vision of participation and engagement in education which is accessible to all. The evidence suggests that accessible and diverse classrooms are beneficial to all learners. So rather than the previous thinking of taking students who have additional needs or specific learning differences and putting them in a separate classroom, including everybody in the same classroom, is the way to go, according to these experts at least. So how can we actually do that? I'm going to show you some tips. Actually, it's a lot of tips. So let me tell you how I'm going to break it down. The first section is going to include some changes that you can make quickly and without too much effort on your part, hopefully. The second section will have some changes that might require a little bit of planning on your part. And the final tips might even require administrative approval, depending on your institution and your teaching context. But what I want you to keep in mind, there are two things I want you to keep in mind. The first thing is that you will not be able to implement all of these changes on Monday, okay? And if you try, you will get overwhelmed and you will get burnt out. You cannot pour from an empty cup, okay? It's great that you want to help, but don't try and do everything at once because it will become too hard and you will give up. Instead, make small, sustainable, incremental changes, and that's how your students will benefit. Your students won't benefit if you're stressing yourself out to make everything perfect for everyone from day one. And the second thing I wanted to remind you of was while you're listening to these tips, think about how they could be helpful for your neurotypical students as well, because we're talking about including everyone. So here we go. Some quick changes that you could make. Allow your students to sit where they would like to sit. Many of your students, especially if they're neurodivergent, will know where they learn best in the classroom. They'll know if it's better for them to sit at the front, right up close to the teacher. That's where they get least distracted. Or they'll know if they need to sit by the window because they know that every 15, 20 minutes or so, they need to switch off their brain for a minute, look out the window, have a little break, and then come back to where they are with everybody else. I saw someone else mention this one as well, free to move. If you've built this inclusive classroom where everybody else is aware that some people feel a very strong urge to move their body at sometimes inopportune moments, then hopefully it's not too distracting if those people get up and move. But if it is a distraction, you could ask those students if they would like to sit at the back of the classroom so that when they stand up and stretch and move or whatever, it's not distracting to most of the class sitting in front of them. And I know that it really depends on your context and the age level that you teach. I teach at the university level, so my students have a lot of freedom. They can get up whenever they want to, but I know that that's not always an option. Another thing you can do is offer frequent breaks. So going back to the Zoom teaching I was telling you about, the sort of standard for teaching 4 teaching hours would be 90 minutes, a 15-minute break followed by 90 minutes. So what I did instead, because I thought people didn't want to sit in front of their computers for 90 minutes straight, was to break it up into 3 one-hour blocks with shorter breaks in between. And the students responded really well to that. And you could make those blocks even shorter. This one could perhaps require administrative approval, but I think in most contexts, you're allowed to say when there's a mini break. I know a lot of people have started incorporating so-called brain breaks into their teaching, and I know that those can be pretty effective. Bulo already talked about the importance of giving good instructions. When I give instructions to my students, I typically try and get their attention, make sure that at least it looks like they're listening to me. Then I will give them the instructions orally, and some of them will get started working, and I will remind them, don't worry, I'm about to put them on the board, and then I will write the instructions on the board so they know exactly what they're doing. I like to also write down the times. So as teachers, I know we love to say, okay, you've got 5 minutes for this task, or you've got 15 minutes for this task. I don't know about you, but many times I've lost track of the 15 minutes myself, and I don't remember when we started the 15 minutes. So what I do now is I say, you've got 15 minutes for this task. I look at my watch, it's 11 o'clock, and I write down 11 to 11:15 on the board so that I don't have to keep track of the time and the students don't have to keep track of the time. They can just focus on the task. So taking away a little bit of their mental load and allowing them to focus on the task at hand rather than these little administrative sort of timing things. Excuse me. Also to do with instructions, try not to jump into things too quickly after giving people instructions. Give them time to process what you've said. You might need to say it again. You know, we've all been there where we've missed something that was said in a classroom, and suddenly you notice, oh no, the teacher has stopped talking. Did she ask a question? What was the question? I didn't hear it. So it can be helpful to just ask things multiple times or wait. When you're writing those instructions on the board, only write the instructions on the board. Don't start talking about the homework that's due next week or another task that the students have to do. People cannot read and listen to two different things at the same time. I'm guilty of this. I'm sure we're all guilty of this, but it's something to think about next time you're standing at the board. Don't speak, just write what you need to write. Bulo already mentioned breaking tasks into smaller chunks. It can make it much more manageable and less daunting. We talked about how people with ADHD, some people with ADHD might find it difficult to start a really big task, but if they see a much smaller task broken into smaller chunks, it might be much more manageable for them. And I know Bulo talked about adding images and things like that. But something to think about is that we have to balance stimulation and distraction. So for some learners, they would really love to have bright colors, beautiful pictures. That is going to make them want to read the article because it looks interesting and it looks like it's going to be fun. Other learners will be distracted by the colors and the photos. So if you're able to, maybe if you work with digital materials, offer a fancy, flashy version and a more pared down, very bare bones version. By the way, if you hear noise in the background, that's my son running up and down the hallway. It's something he likes to do. He calls it the zoomies. Okay, he's okay. He's just getting his energy out. So what are some things that might need a little bit more planning? Well, making group work optional. I know Claire talked about this a little bit in her talk. I know it's a language class. I know we would love for our students to talk. Trust me, the students will talk to each other and work together when they feel comfortable and when they feel safe. There are some days where they just don't want to talk to people and they still get the work done. So think about when you can make group work optional and when it absolutely has to be group work or pair work. I'll give them the chance, this goes into Universal Design for Learning a little bit, UDL, give them the chance to, if it doesn't have to be a written assignment, if they just need to show you that they learned something, can they record a narrated PowerPoint? Can they send you an MP3 voice note that you can grade instead? Think about different ways that they can present to you that they've learned something. And this goes for assessments as well. I don't know what learning platform you use. We use Moodle at my institution. I know there's also Blackboard. They have a highlight feature where you can highlight the current week, which can be really helpful for people who might be overwhelmed by a ton of text on a Moodle course. It's a small thing, but it can make a big difference. It's important to give your courses and your classes a clear structure and a routine so that students know what's coming and they don't have to waste precious processing power thinking about what's coming next because they already know and they can use it for other things. I know we're language teachers, but you might want to offer guidance on note taking, time management, organization. Speaking of time management, I'm almost finished. Sorry, Will. and just giving them little tips on things that help you and showing them different ways to take notes. I love doing this, you know, I really force my students to brainstorm. And at the end of it, when they're doing a listening task, and at the end of them, some of them say, I hated that. That was not my way of taking notes. And I said, excellent, you learned something about yourself today. Let's see if the next way of taking notes is better for you. And you show them a different way, a variety of different ways of doing this, and maybe one of them will resonate with them. Tap into that hyper focus. Let them, as much as you can, give them freedom on topic choice. Let them write about what they want to write about. And I say it every time we're doing presentations or essays or whatever. Choose something you're interested in, because only that will keep you going, right? I'm clearly very interested in my PhD topic, because that has to keep me going over 5 years. It's a part-time PhD. You have to be dedicated to keep going and interested. And of course, know who you can send students to for further assistance if they need testing accommodations or special educational plans, individual educational plans, those sorts of things. Finally, things which might need administrative approval. It's an easy change for me. I'm very flexible on punctuality with my students. I don't see it as a personal failing that a student is late. I say, you know, just come in quietly, sit down, get started. But they're adults, and I know that's very different to when you teach children. But perhaps reassess your ideas about punctuality and what. I always offer deadline extensions, no questions asked, to all of my students. I don't require a medical certificate or anything. I just let them have the extra time. And we did have a very cute puppy in one of my classes once. It was a service dog in training. We weren't allowed to pet him, but he was very cute. His name was, I think, Zigzag, if I remember correctly. Adorable. But keep this in mind, that this is something that might be helpful for some students. A separate room for assessments, if that's possible. Again, that's typically something that you would talk about with your administration, because you need an extra supervisor for that. And this one might be a little bit controversial. When my students are doing longer stretches of quiet work, so they're writing or reading, or maybe even sometimes during assessments, I allow them to use earplugs to block out all the extra noise, or even put in their headphones and listen to music. No, I'm not afraid of cheating, but you know your students best. And some of my students, the look on their faces when they find out they can block out the noise with their favorite music, it's worth it. And I like to think that they can perform better when they feel more comfortable. Ooh, okay. Most of all, I encourage you to be open, be patient, be kind, and ask questions. If you don't know, just ask questions. On the next slide are my references. Feel free to screenshot them. Some of them are papers, which you may or may not have access to. Sorry about that. On the next slide, I'm going to show you some further reading resources, which are more aimed at teachers and practitioners, especially the last two texts by Anne Margaret Smith. I think they're really wonderful resources, and I encourage you to check them out. So go ahead and take a screenshot of that if you're interested. Thank you so much for listening and for sticking around all the way through the third talk. Here's how you can keep in touch with me.